Hello, podcast listeners. Phone Rabbits giving you a brief introduction to episode 11 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we have Shakespeare-Gurl being interviewed by Taz from Taz. Surprisingly, not about Shakespeare, but actually about her field of focus, which is what we call medieval Japan, or what is called in the interview, at least medieval Japan. There is some discussion about the nomenclature there, which is not quite settled because apparently it's not a very settled question. But more importantly, it's a focus on the maritime violence of this period. So what we would then call, basically at this point, the piracy of this period. So I hope you enjoy this discussion of piracy in Japan during the medieval period. There's also mentioned discussion about the difficulties of doing research with such a language barrier in between, and the problems of translated text and all that. I certainly learned a whole lot about it, and if you are an average Ask Historians subscriber, Ask Historians podcast listener, you're from the Anglosphere, where this period of time may have been a bit neglected. Also, you're probably very good looking since you are an average subscriber. So please sit back, enjoy with your good-looking self this podcast on the Heian period of Japan and Japanese piracy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
All right, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast, Essie.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Cheers, no, not a problem at all. Thanks for taking the time. So your particular flair covers Japanese history. What part of Japanese history is your specialty, I guess?
So I grew up with dad in the Navy, so I spent a lot of time on boats. So I study maritime history. I'm very interested in maritime history wherever, and I started studying Japanese in high school, so fell in love with Japanese history. And that really wasn't directly your question, but I do medieval. So the 12th century to like the 14th century.
Okay. So Japanese 12th to 14th century maritime focused history, I guess. Okay. And you're currently doing your master's, I understand?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's your focus of study there?
Japanese studies is the name of my master's, but I'm focusing on history, art history / archaeology and museum studies.
Okay. And you're looking to take it further?
Yes, I've applied to PhD programs and I'm waiting.
All right, now fingers crossed that goes pretty well.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. All right. So when you're, in your field of history, what are some of the particular difficulties, I guess, in research? Language, I guess, the language barrier would be a big one.
Language barrier is a huge one, especially doing primary research in pre-modern documents. Fortunately, they're all put into type. Well, most of them have been put into type and are in published volumes, so they're pretty easy to access. They're not very well indexed yet, but they're at least legible, so we don't have to read a lot of handwriting. But it is a different language.
Yeah. Okay. And so are they dead languages? Does anyone still speak them anymore today, or?
Not as far as like creating new things with them. The classical Japanese is still used in poetry, especially like reading poetry. I mean, it's classical Japanese is still taught in high schools and stuff, but it's kind of like Latin, where you learn to read it so you can understand the poetry, and that's about its use.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not like a conversational language.
No.
Okay.
No, although it would be pretty awesome to have a conversation in classical Japanese.
Right. Maybe there'll be some other people on the sub who can speak classical Japanese. I wouldn't bet against it. Okay, so when we're talking about naval stuff, and one of the things that looking through some of the answers that you've given on Ask Historians and stuff, Japanese piracy has been a bit of a focus of yours. Yes.
Yes. Well, Japanese maritime violence, I like to call it, but piracy sounds a bit cooler.
Okay, so let's explore the difference then. So maritime violence, what do you mean by that?
So by maritime violence, I mean any sort of violent action taken on the water or on the shores, which are called littoral areas, so
yes.
Shorelines and
rivers and things
anywhere,
like that go in.
Rivers and and that encompasses things like even boarding another boat or stealing their goods, whether or not there's bloodshed. It also encompasses things like the threat of violence, and it includes state-sanctioned and non-sanctioned violence, which piracy tends to fall under the non-sanctioned violence.
Okay. Well, actually, we might do a bit of background and context. So, what did 12th century Japan look like? I guess what sort of power structures were there? What sort of relationships did they have with neighbors? All that sort of stuff.
Well, so I guess starting with internal. This is the end of what's called the Heian period, which has been called the classical period, the Renaissance. I don't really like that name, but
bit Eurocentric, eh?
It's a bit Eurocentric, and it doesn't. Well, even classical period is kind of, because it makes you think of ancient Rome.
Yeah,
At least it makes me think of ancient Rome, and it's, I don't know. I guess it's putting it in its own light with rose-colored glasses here. And a lot of people will say, like, there was no violence during this period, or there was less violence. And it's like there was still violence, and it was still court-sanctioned and unsanctioned.
Right.
But
so actually, when you say court-sanctioned, what court are you referring to there?
I'm referring to the Heian court, the imperial institution, which is hard to just say like the emperor, because there was an emperor, there's a string of emperors, but they weren't the only or even the main power at this point. There was an emperor, there was a retired emperor, there was a regent, there was a court of aristocrats with a lot
retired
of landholding.
Okay, so they weren't emperors for life?
No, they either willingly retired or they were forced to abdicate, depending on who it was and the environment around them. They definitely weren't, like, if you think about absolute monarchies, for example, it was not even close to that.
Okay, so how was the, dynastic succession, I guess? So it wasn't common for an emperor to be succeeded by his children?
It was, they were almost always one of the emperor's children, if not always one of the emperor's children, but the emperor usually had multiple partners, and his children were raised by his partners' families. So whoever had the emperor's son, who was picked to be the next emperor, who was named the crown prince, would have control of that next generation of the emperor.
Right. But otherwise you'd have like a lot of, I guess, local lords that would control their own particular areas?
They actually didn't control the areas as much as they collected revenue from the areas. Most aristocrats didn't leave the capital at this point, but they had land holdings outside of the capital,
so
and
like
that's where they got their money from. Yeah.
Okay. So all the nobles lived in, what was it, Kyoto at this point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or Heian, alternately. It's the same place.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, so it just changed its name, or?
Yeah, and I'm not sure when it changed its name, because at some point during the Heian period, they like to call it Heian. And then after that, the secondary sources don't really call it anything, or like they'll call it Kyoto, but in the documents they just call it the capital. So right. I'm not really sure when that changed.
Okay. Now, when we're talking about piracy, you've mentioned, I've read about how they tended to apply the word piracy to a lot of different things, and to a lot of different people. So what were Japanese pirates? Were they guys with peg legs and eye patches?
Probably not. Although, I guess injuries happen. But these were basically littoral people, or sometimes, inland people who decided to move to the waterside and, engage in these activities. And they just lived on the water. They made their living by exploiting maritime resources, be they fish or other boats. And they were just outside of state control, which is why they get the term, they get named by the state as pirates.
Okay, so even though they might have been fishermen, they were still pirates.
They could have been. They were definitely mistrusted because they were on the water. Okay,
so when we have how maritime facing was Japanese culture at this point? Were they It's hard to say, but you've definitely got some cultures that are very much draw a lot of their identity from the sea, whereas other cultures not so much. So, and I said I wouldn't do this last time, but I was just going to look at, say, Romans versus the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were very much a sort of a maritime and trade focused power, whereas Romans were a lot more of a land-based military power. So I guess, how did the Japanese see themselves at this point, considering they were on a bunch of islands?
You would think because they were on a bunch of islands that they would be a very outward, well, not outward, but water-facing people, and they, at least the court, where all of the political records are and all the laws are very much written as a land-based power. So even if they're collecting seaweed or fish and as tax goods, they're marking it as rice because that is a land legible good.
Right, so they would convert everything to rice.
Yeah.
As the
so they were very definitely the court saw itself as a land-based polity, and that had been that way since they formed.
Right. And so how centralized was, I mean, is it even correct to talk about the Japanese state at this point? How did they think of themselves?
They weren't called Japan at this point. I guess at this point there's no specific border to what we now call the country of Japan.
Yep.
They have provinces all the way up to the northeastern edge of Honshu, which is the main island. How well that was controlled is debatable.
Okay.
It gets more and more central control at the later into the 10th century that we go. And then its western edge is Kyushu, and Tsushima is in between Kyushu and Korea. Right. That has identified as Korean or Japanese. We're not sure. At some point, it became Japanese. I don't really know when.
Okay.
So it's they're very political boundaries are very flexible at this point, and it's really a matter of how much central power the court has in a given time, so that they can extend outward and pull resources from outward territories.
Right. So who else was living on the Japanese islands, I guess, apart from the people that we all come to call the Japanese?
There were the Japanese people, and then there in the northeastern part of Honshu there were the Emishi, and by this point, by my period, they're pretty well subjugated. At least on the main island, and they've been intermarried and adopted the Japanese court culture.
Okay.
But they still remained on northern islands, and the Ainu, who are currently the indigenous minority in Hokkaido, the northernmost island, are considered to possibly be their descendants.
Okay. All right. Now, I guess it'd be remiss of me not to ask about samurai. Were there samurai, or what did Japanese land warriors look like at this point?
They were called bushi, not samurai. So samurai is a bit of an anachronism, and definitely the image that, I don't know, like when I hear samurai, I'm thinking with the horns on the helmet and
the
thing that they styled, the flag and the sweeping wings on the helmet and the laced armor, and they definitely had some of those characteristics. They had laced armor, and I guess one of the other images is they always fought with swords. They fought on foot and they fought with swords, or maybe they fought on horseback, but they fought with swords. They really didn't fight with swords. Swords are really not a good weapon to fight with if you don't want to die. So at this period they're fighting primarily with bows, and actually one of the words for warriors is the people of the horse and the bow. Which really connects warriors with their animal and their weapon, and I think is pretty significant in challenging that samurai sword fighter
sort of stereotype. I guess. Yeah. So what sort of bows did they use?
That is a really good question.
Sorry, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Sorry, I mean... Yeah, because I've seen old photographs of samurai with these bows, and they hold them like not at the midpoint. They sort of hold them sort of 2/3 down the bow, and they just look weird from my
Yeah,
from what I'm
I don't
understanding.
know that they had those same bows, because you have to be standing to fire that kind of bow,
Yeah.
because they're like bigger than the person. I
Yeah.
don't think they had. I mean, they couldn't have had those same bows. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure at this point. I had some pretty cool pictures of them, but I had to find different words when I was translating the Tale of Heike, and they had all these different words for the types of arrowheads and the feathers, and they have dictionaries with those.
Yeah, so they do go into the detail about that then. Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
Actually, warriors at this point, were they likely to be conscripts or full-time professionals or a mix?
They were professionals at this point. There were families that made their living off of patronage from different aristocratic houses, including the emperor, and they eventually became kind of a more hereditary thing. But conscripts didn't start until much later, like during the 16th century, possibly a little bit before. They might have had some conscripted soldiers before that, but for the most part, these warriors fought on horseback using bows, which takes a lot of training and money to have the horses and feed the horses, and you don't just pick it up, and it's definitely not something you can do in mass formations. So
horses is a bit of an odd. I mean, I've never been to Japan, but in my conceptualization, Japan is basically all mountains, lakes, and coast. Were horses a big part of the Japanese economy, I guess?
Economy, yes, surprisingly. So Japan is mostly mountains and coast, but there are a couple plain areas, and in the eastern part of Honshu, in Kanto and the Tohoku area, that's where we call it that right now. But that was one of the big horse raising areas. Also Tsushima, which I mentioned before, is between Kyushu and Korea. Also, for some reason, I'm not really sure why there were a bunch of horses there, but we know they were trading horses or sending horses to China from that island, and that just blows my mind because it's not that big of an island. But there was also possibly connection with northeastern Asia, getting horses from there. But the general information that we know now is that the Japanese horses aren't those big war chargers that we think of with European knights. They weren't giant horses. They were kind of like big ponies.
Okay.
For the most part.
Okay. So, let's look at how things were on the water at this point. Was there much trade going on between the Japanese islands and the Asian mainland?
Yeah. Especially during the middle 12th century, trade with China really picked up under the Taira family. They were trading primarily with China, for that particular family, but they had a pretty constant connection with that whole sphere.
Okay, and what sort of ships were they using at this point?
The Japanese ships are, well, they're not really ships, they're boats. They're
sorry.
No, it's actually, they have ships, but the indigenous ones are basically a tree, and you burn out the middle of it. It's called a dugout canoe, and then you build up some sides and lay some planks in between. You could lash two together and maybe put oars on it somehow. I don't really know how these things
the sea between Japan and China on dugouts.
Well, technically you could. That's they have evidence of prehistoric people doing that. But for the most part, the trade didn't happen on those because those aren't very good boats. They had Song Chinese ships. They're called junks, and those were planked boats and had sails and were significantly larger than the Heian dugout boat things.
Okay. So I jumped around a bit. Right. So they had sailed ships that would sail across. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, they got them from China.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned. I guess, is it a book? The Tale of the Heike. What is the Tale of the Heike?
It's an epic poem. It was completed in 14 something or other, maybe 1390 something. I could look up the date if we need an exact date, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's an epic poem. kind of like the Iliad or Song of Roland, Beowulf
Right.
type thing. A little bit less mythology. I mean, it has actual historical figures. Kind of like that's one of the reasons I like to compare it to Song of Roland. It does have historical figures in a historical setting that's not entirely myth, but it covers the Genpei War, or what is known as the Genpei War, between the Taira and the Minamoto clans or families for power or for control of the court.
Okay,
the
so
Imperial Court.
did you want to go into that a little bit? So the Taira, now you mentioned them before, they're the people who had all the control of the trade, yes?
Yes, they were. They had a lot of influence over the Seto Inland Sea area in terms of owning a lot of the boats, and they had a lot of land holdings on rivers.
Okay, and the Minamoto, now I recognize that name, I think anyway. Most of my understanding of Japanese history comes through playing Civilization, so it's super accurate. But so the Minamoto, so what was their power base, I guess?
So the Minamoto are actually famous for the quote-unquote first shogun, Minamoto Yoritomo. And their power base was in the east. So they had the horses and the iron and the silver, or at least that was that region's power base. That area's warriors tended to see a lot more action than Western warriors because of conflicts, either with the emishi or with areas that just were less under court control. So they tended to be more, I don't know, better trained warriors. I guess they had more experience.
Okay.
In warfare.
Yeah, fair enough. So, but did they have any ships at all? Or, I mean, I guess if you're on that edge of Japan, I mean, what are you going to do with your ships, really? I guess go up and down the coast.
Well, they could have gone up to Hokkaido, or I guess you'd have to go around to go to northeastern Asia, the mainland of northeastern Asia. But they did not have their own boats. They contracted with other quote-unquote pirates to fight against the Heike.
So the pirates were all over Japan at this point, surrounded by pirates.
I guess if you want to think about that, but really they were just sea people. They were people who they were able to, stand on a boat and shoot an arrow and not get seasick.
Right.
And I guess they were able to not run into the rocks in the water. So.
Righto. So how lawless were these sea people, I guess? I mean, it's one thing if the central state thinks of them all as outlaws. I guess how nasty people were they, or were most of them just trying to get along?
Unfortunately, they didn't leave a lot of documents, so really the information we have from them is from the court's perspective. So it is all these, these horrible, barbaric kaizokus. It's basically like water bandit, so it's what we translate as pirate. But we really don't know. I mean, eventually they start to form very similar to daimyo houses, where they become kind of like sea lords in their own right, and they're, the heads of the daimyo during the 16th century are petitioning them for protection on the water. So they eventually they take a form that's recognizable by the land-based powers, but at this point there are so few, there are no documents from their perspective, so we don't really know. But at the same time, the Taira, who were an aristocratic family, were called pirates as well, and they had water power. They fought on the water, they traded on the water. So it could be a range of people. It could be aristocrats, it could be, people who just fish and are good on boats.
Right. So the tale of the Heike tells the story of a conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto. Do you want to give us the thumbnail sketch of the story? Who won, I guess?
Well, the Minamoto won. They won, and then they consider that the rise of the warriors. It's a very Marxist term. That's not quite accurate, but right. This is when you see the foundation of the Kamakura shogunate. But it actually wasn't just between the Taira and the Minamoto. It was between the Taira and retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who wanted the Taira out of imperial politics and wanted his but I can't even say his lineage because the Taira's grandson, who was Emperor Antoku, was also Go Shirakawa's grandson.
Right.
But he wanted not Taira blood on the throne.
Okay. And did they say any particular reason why, or I mean, who knows why? I guess why some of these fights start up between the rich and powerful.
Well, I think partly because the Taira weren't always rich and powerful. They were rich and powerful because of their trade with China. So they were kind of newcomers, and they were definitely newcomers into the regency, which was one of the ways that aristocrats controlled the imperial lineage by marrying their daughters into the emperor's family to get control of the kids. And so that was the game that the Taira joined, and they did it very successfully, and actually under Go Shirakawa's patronage for a really long time. I guess he didn't realize how much he was going to come to regret that. But so I just partly because they were newcomers and they had a falling out with Go Shirakawa, and within a couple of years, he's arrested under their control, and they're forcing his son to resign from the throne and putting their grandson, who's like 5, on the throne, and it kind of all explodes within a couple of years.
Right. So how does it end for the Taira? So the Minamoto won. What does that look like for the Taira?
The last battle was actually kind of cool. It was a sea battle. And the Taira surprisingly lost that battle, which I guess means it's the last battle. Obviously they lost if they lost the war. But during that final battle, the emperor's grandmother, who was a nun at that point, is, according to the tale of Heike at least, grabbed her grandson, who was the emperor, and they both jumped into the water and drowned. And the emperor at these points still a child, yeah? Yeah, he died when he was 5, so right. He would have been put on the throne when he was like 2.
Okay.
So he's still a child. So they both drown along with the imperial sword, which is one of the marks of being an emperor. There's this one specific sword. So they lose that. Some of the Taira who try to drown themselves are fished out of the water. They're then paraded through the capital and beheaded.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that was the end of the Taira family, I guess.
For the most part, yeah.
Right. Okay. Alrighty. So did that actually have an impact on Japanese trade at all? With a major sort of trading family getting wiped out, was there a noticeable sort of drawing in, I guess?
I'm actually not sure. There was so much destabilization internally at that point, right. As well as this is shortly before the Mongols invade China. So I'm not sure when the disruption happened.
Right, and I mean that Mongol invasion had cast a pretty long shadow, I would have thought, across the whole region. Okay, so actually, talking about the maritime sort of stuff, do we know much at all about how they navigated or kept maps and things like that?
Not as much as I would like to know. Some of the maps that I've seen, I've actually only seen land maps, and they're not recognizable as anything except for they'll say like the place, they'll like have the name written down or a certain mountain written down in Chinese characters, and that's the only way you know where this is supposed to even be, because it doesn't look like anything. It's circles and squares basically, with occasional borders drawn in. So
the conceptualization was not particularly useful then.
Yeah. Okay. So as far as the people who didn't leave us any documents, how they were working out navigation, I would assume there's some influence from Chinese navigation, but I don't know what that is, and we've got no proof of any of that.
Righto. Now you mentioned earlier that you look into the politics of water. You've done some work on the politics of water. So how would how would that take place? So if there's trying to control trade as it comes in and trade goods, was there things like smuggling to get around tariffs and taxes and things like that, or was there tolls to pay, or how would they go about sort of controlling sea travel and trade?
Well, the only way to control sea travel or trade at all is to control the ports. At this point, I'm not sure who is in control of the ports. Later, as the maritime families are kind of collecting more.
All right, and we are back. Sorry about that. You were talking about ports and control thereof.
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to research is what ports were active or most active and who was in control of those. I haven't done that research yet, so I can't answer that right now. But that is one of the only ways to control the water, because you can't have boats policing the water all the time at this period. I mean, now we have radar and stuff like that and GPS to do that. But even with all of our technology, we still can't control the water. It's just too big, and people who live on it know it better than people who don't. So aside from ports, you mentioned tolls. Those were in place, but those were sea people controlling those. They had areas where, especially, and then this is like 14th century onwards that they start doing this, but they would keep lookouts on the mountains on little islands. The Seto Inland Sea has just a ton of islands, and they're very small, not really inhabited, but they would have lookouts, and they'd see a boat coming, so they'd send their guys out in other boats, chase this boat down, demand payment for safe passage. So it was kind of like a protection racket.
Okay.
But that was not state controlled. That was the sea people doing that to merchants and other forms of movement on the water.
Right, okay. And so I guess there'd be a sliding scale of legitimacy for how much that was worth. I mean, in some cases they may have actually been providing a legitimate protection service, and in other cases they were the only threat out there, more or less.
We're not sure who all was the threat out there, but certainly by the 16th century, the families who were doing this, and there were multiple families doing this, were seen as legitimate by the land-based powers, and they were actually petitioned to yearly offer this protection, and the daimyo would just send them letters and money once a year, and they would get these flags to show that we're under this family's protection.
Oh, okay. So that's how it'd be done. So you pay your money, and they'd give you a special flag to run up.
That's one of the ways, especially later on, that it starts getting done, and they did that for merchants too. Merchants could petition them. So they were, even though they're called pirates now, they were seen by their peers and as legitimate. And so the water then became their territory, and it was recognized that to be on their territory, you had to get their permission.
Okay, so did they make any sort of distinction like you'd see in the West between pirates and privateers?
Early on, I've found documents that show a written distinction, sort of. In the 9th century, I found a document that is requesting, I guess if you read it in English, it would be requesting barbarians to help subdue the pirates. So
got to give me some of them barbarians.
Yeah, but the barbarians were quote unquote barbarians. The Fushu it's a very pejorative term, right. But this is read as these are probably also pirates or also sea people who commit maritime violence, but they're doing it under the auspices of the state versus people who are outside of the state who are against the state. So these guys get the water bandit. The against the state people get the water bandit term, and the for the state people get the slightly less bad bandit or barbarian term. Right. So I guess there's a distinction, like barbarian versus pirate, but neither of those is very good.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Damning with faint praise.
Yeah.
All right. And so what would violence on the water look like? Was it a particularly dangerous stretch of sea to travel for traders?
Well, there were a lot of these, I like to call it maritime interference because, us historians have to have fancy words for things. We can't just call it piracy.
Yeah. Get it right, people.
But so,
gosh.
those people who were engaged in maritime interference were primarily in the Seto Inland Sea, which was partly because there are a lot of places to hide. There are a lot of places to go to land or launch from. There are also a lot of bottleneck areas where you could trap boats, and it's also the major trade route from Kyoto to China.
Okay. And so maritime interference, what would it look like? Would, I mean, because I'm just thinking of the various types of piracy that I'm familiar with. So in Barbary, they'd capture the ships and take everyone as slaves, and you'd never see the light of day again, or something like that. Or would they, just take some of your stuff? I mean, what what was your fate if you got captured by some pirates? What was going to happen?
The documents that we have regarding people who have encountered this violence and are reporting it are basically claims to why they didn't get the goods to the port that they were expected to. So they'll say we lost this many goods to pirates, right, and we need this much money in to compensate for that. So it looks like they just took their goods. I don't know that they took their ships. That wouldn't make sense because they probably had better ships.
Yep.
Or at least ones that suited their needs better, which weren't always needing to travel over the big water. They were more moving in between little islands.
Yep.
As far as slavery goes, it existed, but I don't know how much these sea people were engaged in it.
Okay.
Unfortunately, slavery isn't one of the things that has been studied. So if anybody's interested in going into medieval Japanese history, there is something to do with slavery, but it's kind of very hidden, and there's nothing written on it in English. So there's dissertation stuff right there.
Right. So there's if you want to get your PhD on. All right. Actually, is this particular area that you're studying? Is there much other work in the field?
Actually, there's recently, well, I guess not recently, he got his PhD in, I think, 2005. Peter Shapinsky, Dr. Peter Shapinsky is kind of the pioneer in maritime Japanese history, at least in English.
Right.
And he's like the guy to go to for anything to do with later medieval piracy. And he's the one who coined the term sea lords. So his stuff is very recent. He's actually working on a book right now.
Okay.
That should be coming out in a couple of months. As far as Japanese medieval history, a lot of the work is being done in the later medieval period, so in the 15th and 16th centuries,
right,
or in the Heian period or the Kamakura. So before the 12th century and the 13th century.
Okay. Now, is there much of a, I guess, modern Japanese scholarship? So you're saying that the Shapinsky guy is the leading scholar in English. Are there any Japanese scholars who look at this, or is there a bit of a divide, I guess, between the English-speaking academics and the Japanese academics?
There's a language barrier, obviously. English language scholars definitely use Japanese language sources. Unfortunately, I have not read a whole lot of Japanese language sources. I've read some of the foundational works, but because of that language barrier, I don't quite know what they're up to. A lot of the books that I read about maritime history have this title of suigun, which is a modern word for like navy.
Okay.
So it'll talk about medieval Japanese navies, which. And when I talked to Professor Shapinsky, he's like, there was no such thing as navy. This word did not exist. So I don't know how much. I don't know about the interplay with that just yet.
Yeah, okay.
I unfortunately am not that well read. I would love to be, but actually, and I forgot to give homage to. There's a professor working on the 14th century as well. Professor Tom Conlon, has recently published a bunch of books on the 14th century, which is nice because that's like the most understudied, particularly in English, period.
Yeah, okay. So are you doing, I guess, original research, or, so the work that you're doing as part of your master's and hoping to do as part of your PhD, what would you be looking to do, I guess?
My project that I've suggested is sort of political regional history, as well as incorporating some religious things. And yeah, it is. I'm trying to do original research. I've only managed one paper so far, which I guess is something better than nothing.
Yeah. And
do
you mind talking about that at all?
Oh yeah, sure. I I guess this is a little bit, it's not in the time period. I keep getting myself stuck in the 12th century, which is very much not the time period that I'm supposed to be researching, but sources are easier to find. That particular project, I was looking at a travel diary from one of the courtiers who accompanied the retired Emperor Takakura on a pilgrimage, and this pilgrimage was to an island called Miyajima. This is the island famous for the Torii Gate, that big red gate in the middle of the water. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen pictures of that.
It's like a wooden door frame sticking out of the water.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
It's like the trunks of the trees are enormous. It's a huge red gate. But that's the Taira family. Well, it's not their family clan shrine, but it serves a similar purpose. So it was a Taira holding, and the Taira kind of co-opted the pilgrimage ritual and for political purposes, and to prove their control or to control this retired emperor so he wouldn't get out of line. And this is during the same period they have Go-Shirakawa in their custody. So that was what I was looking at, what I've been looking at so far. But I would like to push that into the 14th century because there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on, and the court's divided. We've got two emperors, and one's legitimized by China and one's not. And they're fighting, and it's a really fascinating period and really not easy to break into, which is why I keep getting stuck in the 12th century.
Right, okay. And so when you say pilgrimage, this was a religious pilgrimage?
This was a This was a religious pilgrimage. Emperors, when they retired, had a tradition dating back to the later part of the 11th century. So it's not like a really old tradition, but retired emperors weren't really old by then, where after they abdicated, they would go on a pilgrimage to the imperial family shrine, which was not far away from Kyoto. And one of the emperors, Go-Shirakawa, made over 100 pilgrimages to these shrines. Wow. And so it was to go, worship their ancestral deity, and get some merit for. For that sort of thing. So is this this would be a Shinto thing, yes? It's really hard to divide Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto got its own special place following the Meiji Restoration, when it became state Shinto, and it was
that's in the 1800s.
Religion. That's in the latter part of the 1800s.
Yeah, okay.
Up through World War II.
Yeah.
And Buddhist institutions were at that time suppressed. But if you go to a Buddhist temple now, there are Shinto gates all over the place. So it's really, when you go there, it's kind of confusing because it's like, wait, I thought this was a Buddhist temple. Why is there Shinto stuff? And there's Shinto stuff because there's really not much of a difference.
Right.
I mean, there's a difference in that they're sort of different deities, but by this point, Shinto deities are considered local avatars of Buddhist deities. So one of the goddesses of the water becomes the Dragon King's daughter, which is from the Lotus Sutra. So they're kind of mapped on in a way.
Okay, so
and this is definitely elite culture. As far as like what local people were thinking, we're not sure. Buddhism wasn't very common among commoners outside of the capital until Ippen was the one who was considered to have spread it around, and that was at the end of the 13th century, I think.
Okay. All right, so pilgrimages, I'm just going through my notes trying to work out where we were up to. And now, so relationships, I guess we could talk a little bit about relationships with China and Korea. So they would trade. Obviously, China was, where it's at as far as trade goes. Was Korea at this point an area that Japan had much control over?
No, they had contact with them, but they were not controlling them. They didn't really have, as far as I know, any control over Korea until the periods before World War II. Although they did invade them a couple of times and failed both times. But which is actually a maritime loss. Hideyoshi totally lost because he didn't have the right boats. But there was trade with Korea, but definitely China seems to be more prominent in terms of trade. They'd sorry.
Yeah, sure. So what would they get from China? So what was Japan after?
Depending on the time period, they're wanting copper coins. In the end of the 14th century, they're looking for copper coins. But even before that, a little bit, that was one of the things the Taira wanted. They were also getting elite goods, furnishings, feathers.
Okay, porcelain and all that.
I don't know how much silk, because Japan also produced silk. So I don't know how much was imported versus domestic made. They definitely were getting pottery, and non-trade goods that were just getting influenced were things like literature, political writings, religious writings, stuff like that.
And actually, we've been talking a lot about dating, so 12th to 14th century. But that's obviously, a Western-centric form of dating. So what sort of dating did the Japanese use to keep track of things?
They, during this period, were using a very convoluted, Western-centric here. It was a convoluted scheme of dating years based on what the emperor wanted to call the years.
Right.
Sorry for those of you listening who find that insulting, but I've spent too much time looking at these charts. So... and some of them were very long. At the end of the 12th century is where you get into these year periods, which are like Kao is one of them, and it's from 1169 to 1171, and then it becomes Shoan, which is from 1171 to 1175. And it just keeps moving like that. So there's like 2 or 3 year periods, and so they'll date it with like Kao Gannen, which would be Kao 1, so 1169, or Kao Sannen would be the 3rd year of Kao, and that would be 1171.
Oh man! So the names that they gave to them, was there any sort of naming convention, or they just named them whatever?
Well, they didn't repeat the same name twice, which is helpful at least. So there aren't 2 Kao Gannens, fortunately. Yeah. So they were good about not repeating that. There are always 2 Chinese characters. I honestly, looking at my chart, I have a list above my computer right now that I was using for my research.
Yeah.
And I don't know what these things are supposed to mean. Like one of them, Bunji. Bun is the character for like writing or letter, and then Ji is to heal, or it's also part of government. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, and that's from 1185 to 1190. So they're just really, I'm sure they had meaning, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, sure. Alrighty, so I guess with that we might wrap it up. We've got our hour. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Essie. It's been delightful. Yes, I've learned. Now I can go and pretend to be an expert about Japanese pirates. So in the break room at work, I'm just going to say, so did you know? Well, actually, I won't do that, but anyway.
Well, sea lords and trade interference, right?
Yeah. Maritime trade interference. That's right. And well, actually, they were boats, not ships. Gosh.
Sorry.
It's all good. Alrighty. So yes, thank you very much for coming on, and hopefully we'll see you around on Ask Historians.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I hope you enjoyed episode 11 of the Ask Historians podcast. Taz from Taz talking to Shakespeare-Gurl about the medieval period of Japan, Japanese piracy during that period, giving an overview of just basically Japan during this kind of few centuries there, and touching on any number of other topics. Hope you learned a lot. Hope you learned as much as I did. If you have follow-up questions, you can always go to reddit.com/r/askhistorians and find the discussion post for this podcast, where you can ask Shakespeare-Gurl any follow-up questions you want. She's already recommended some additional reading materials, so if you want to go there, we'll have that in kind of the show notes for this podcast. If you do like the podcast, please let people know. If you don't like the podcast, of course, don't tell anyone. But if you do like the podcast, rate and review us on iTunes, which bumps us up through some sort of government conspiracy to the top of the list. We're also available on any number of other platforms. And if you have a particular platform you want us to get on, let us know. And, we're not the most particularly technologically gifted people, but we'll do our best to make it available to you. But we are, of course, available on iTunes. We also have a Libsyn page, which will be in the show notes for this discussion post. So you can find this podcast and all the past podcasts for the Ask Historians and leave questions, leave comments, let us know. But most importantly, thanks for listening.